Richard Collins was a man everyone in the city knew. He was rich, powerful, and respected. His face often appeared on magazines, and his name was always in the news. People whispered about his business empire and admired his luxury cars, his mansion, and his private jet. To the outside world, he seemed untouchable, a man who had it all. But behind the expensive suits and the confident smile, Richard was alone. He had no family by his side, no close friends to call late at night. His phone never rang unless it was about money or business. And though he sat at long tables filled with food, he always ate alone. Still, he told himself this was the price of success, and he carried on. One rainy evening, Richard left his office later than usual. The tall glass building stood silent behind him as he walked toward his shining black car. His driver had the night off, so he decided to drive himself. The streets were slick with rain, the city lights reflecting in every puddle. Richard felt restless, his mind clouded with thoughts of his next big deal. He didn't notice how tired he was, how heavy his eyes felt. The highway was almost empty. Richard pressed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring under his control. He liked the speed, it gave him a sense of power. But power can vanish in an instant. It happened so quickly. A truck swerved ahead of him, tires screeching on the wet road. Richard tried to turn the wheel, but the car spun out of control. The sound of metal crashing against the guardrail filled the night. His body jolted forward as the airbags exploded. Pain shot through him like fire, his chest tightening, his breath fading. The car stopped, but Richard didn't. His life seemed to keep spinning. In the silence after the crash, only the rain and his shallow breathing could be heard. His vision blurred, and his hands trembled on the wheel. For the first time in years, the millionaire felt something stronger than money, fear. He tried to move, but his body was weak. His phone had flown somewhere during the crash. No one was near. No one was coming. His empire, his wealth, his name, none of it could save him now. The minutes dragged on like hours. Richard felt his heartbeat slowing, every breath heavier than the last. Memories of his life flashed before him, the signing of contracts, the sound of applause, the endless chase for more. But no faces appeared in those memories. No loved ones. No family. Only him, always alone. For the first time, he wondered if his life had been worth it. What use was all this wealth if he might die here, unseen, forgotten, on the side of a wet highway? His head dropped back against the seat, his eyelids heavy. Darkness pressed closer, threatening to pull him under. Just before he lost consciousness, a thought struck him like lightning. Is this how my story ends? A millionaire with everything, but no one to hold my hand. As the rain poured harder, Richard's car sat broken by the roadside, its lights flickering weakly. The city roared in the distance, unaware that one of its most powerful men lay helpless and broken. His life now hung by a thread. And yet, fate had other plans. Because in that very moment, footsteps approached. Not the polished shoes of a businessman or the sirens of an ambulance, but worn-out sneakers splashing through puddles. A figure bent down, peering into the shattered window of the car. The eyes of a stranger met Richard's fading gaze. And this stranger was not someone the millionaire ever expected. The stranger leaned closer to the broken window, rain dripping down their worn jacket. In the faint glow of the car's hazard lights, Richard saw a face he had never expected. It was a man in his late 40s, with rough hands and tired eyes. His clothes were old, patched in many places, and a bag full of scrap metal hung from his shoulder. He was a recycler, one of those people Richard's world barely noticed. "Sir, can you hear me?" the man shouted, his voice urgent. Richard tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped his lips. His chest ached, every breath sharp like glass. The recycler didn't waste time. He pulled at the jammed door, but it wouldn't move. He looked around, desperate, and spotted a piece of metal lying on the ground. Using all his strength, he forced the door open with a loud creak. Rain poured inside as the man reached for Richard. "Stay with me, sir. Don't close your eyes," he begged. Richard, half conscious, could barely understand. He had never been touched by someone like this, someone society called poor, someone he had never looked at twice. Yet here this man was, holding him carefully as if his life mattered more than anything. The recycler dragged him out of the car, his muscles straining. The wet ground soaked them both, but he didn't care. He tore off his own jacket and placed it under Richard's head, shielding him from the cold pavement. "Help!" the man shouted into the night, but the road was empty. No cars, no people, only the storm. He knew he couldn't wait for others. If he did, the millionaire might not survive. With shaking hands, he pulled out an old phone from his pocket and dialed emergency services. His voice cracked as he explained the accident, giving the location as best as he could. "Hold on, sir. They're coming," he whispered. Richard's vision flickered in and out. He saw the man's face above him, filled with determination. For a brief moment, Richard wondered why. Why would someone with nothing risk so much for him? The recycler checked Richard's breathing, pressing his ear close to his mouth. Panic rose when he felt how weak it was. He remembered something he had once seen on television. Without hesitation, he began pressing on Richard's chest, counting softly, trying to keep the man alive. Every push was filled with hope, every second a battle against death. Time felt endless. The rain soaked through their clothes, the night colder with each passing minute. But the recycler didn't stop. His hands hurt, his arms trembled, but he kept going. He didn't know this man. He didn't know his name. Yet something deep inside told him that every life mattered, even the life of a millionaire who probably never thought about people like him. At last, the faint sound of sirens cut through the storm. Red and blue lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter and closer. Relief washed over the recycler's face. He raised his arms, waving frantically to guide them. The ambulance screeched to a stop. Paramedics rushed out, lifting Richard onto a stretcher. They worked quickly, checking his pulse, attaching tubes and wires. The recycler stepped back, breathing hard, his body shaking from exhaustion and cold. "Who are you?" one paramedic asked as they loaded Richard into the ambulance. "No one," the man replied softly. "Just someone who found him." The paramedic gave a quick nod before closing the doors. The siren wailed again as the ambulance sped into the night, carrying the broken millionaire to safety. The recycler stood alone on the roadside, rain pouring down his face. His clothes were soaked, his hands scraped and bleeding. Yet he felt no regret. He had done what he could. Saving a life was enough for him. As the ambulance disappeared, the man picked up his bag of scraps and slowly walked away. To the world, he was invisible. But tonight, he was a hero. Back inside the ambulance, Richard's weak heart beat on, unaware of the sacrifice made for him. He would wake later, confused, wondering who had saved him. And he would not rest until he found out. For now, his life hung by a fragile thread, tied not to wealth or power, but to the kindness of a stranger no one had expected. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Richard Collins lay in the bed, his chest bandaged, his body weak. Bright light from the ceiling pressed against his tired eyes. Slowly, he opened them, his mind foggy, his memories scattered. For a moment, he couldn't remember what had happened. Then, like a wave crashing over him, the images returned, the rain, the spinning car, the crash, and then, the face of a stranger. Rough hands pulling him out. A voice shouting for him to stay awake. A man who looked like no one he had ever known. Richard turned his head and saw flowers on the side table. A card read, "Wishing you a quick recovery," from the board of directors. Cold words, businesslike, without warmth. He sighed. Even here, surrounded by machines keeping him alive, the only people who reached out to him were those who wanted something. The door opened, and two men in suits walked in, his assistants. Their smiles were polite but empty. "Mr. Collins, thank God you're awake," one said. "The doctors say you'll recover in time. We've already arranged for your schedule to be adjusted. The investors are waiting for updates once you're ready." Richard stared at them in silence. Investors. Schedules. Deals. Did no one care about him, the man lying in this bed? "Who saved me?" Richard asked suddenly, his voice hoarse. The assistants glanced at each other. "Sir." "Someone pulled me out of the car," Richard said firmly. "Someone kept me alive until the ambulance came." "Who was it?" They hesitated. "We don't know, sir. The paramedics only said a passerby called for help. No name was given." Richard's brows furrowed. A passerby. A stranger had risked everything for him, and yet no one even knew his name? The assistants tried to change the subject, but Richard waved them away. "Leave me," he said sharply. "All of you. I need to think." When the door shut, Richard closed his eyes again. His mind would not rest. He saw flashes of the man's face, wet hair plastered to his forehead, old clothes clinging to his body, eyes filled with urgency. This was no businessman, no wealthy figure. This was someone society ignored, someone Richard's world never cared about. And yet, that man had saved him when no one else was there. The thought burned inside him. For years, Richard had believed money could solve everything. But lying in that hospital bed, he realized something shocking. His billions had been useless in the moment he needed help most. His savior was not a doctor on his payroll or a loyal assistant, it was a stranger with nothing to his name. Richard tried to sleep, but the thought kept haunting him. He owed his life to someone he didn't know. And that debt was heavier than all the deals he had ever signed. Days passed, and his body slowly healed. But his heart felt restless. Visitors came, board members, business partners, even rivals who wanted to show their faces. All of them spoke about business, money, reputation. Not one asked if he was lonely, not one asked if he was afraid. Each night, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the accident in his mind. He remembered how close death had felt, how cold the world seemed as he lay in the rain. And then, he remembered those hands pressing against his chest, keeping him alive. "Who are you?" Richard whispered into the empty room. "Why would you save me?" The hospital staff had no answers. The police had no report of the man's name. It was as if his rescuer had vanished back into the shadows, leaving no trace. But Richard knew one thing, he could not let it go. He would not rest until he found the man who had saved him. For the first time in his life, this was not about money, not about power, it was about gratitude. It was about a debt he could never repay with gold or contracts. One evening, Richard asked his driver to bring him newspapers from the day of the crash. He searched every article, every headline. The reports all spoke of an unidentified passerby who had acted quickly to save the millionaire's life. No details. No picture. Just words. Frustration burned inside him, but beneath it was something deeper, a strange, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was humility. For the first time, Richard realized how small he was compared to the value of a single human act of kindness. He clenched his fist weakly on the bed. "I will find you," he whispered to the memory of that stranger. "You saved my life, and I will not forget it. I don't care how long it takes, I will find you." Outside the hospital window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere out there, the man who had changed Richard's fate walked quietly, unseen, unknown. But soon, that would change. Richard Collins was a man who never gave up on what he wanted. And now, more than wealth, more than power, he wanted one thing above all, to look into the eyes of the man who had saved him, and say thank you. Richard Collins was not a man who liked mysteries. In business, he demanded clear answers. If a deal was not perfect, he tore it apart until he understood every detail. But now, lying awake in his mansion after being released from the hospital, one mystery burned inside him more than any business problem. Who had saved his life? The question would not leave him. He could still see the rescuer's tired face, hear his urgent voice through the storm. That man was out there somewhere, living quietly, forgotten by society. And Richard could not rest until he found him. The next morning, Richard called his personal investigator, a man named Harris. "I want every camera near the highway checked. Street cameras, traffic lights, anything. I want to know who pulled me from that car." Harris nodded. "Yes, sir. But it may take time." "Then take the time," Richard replied sharply. "I don't care what it costs." Days turned into weeks. Richard returned to his company, but his heart wasn't in the board meetings anymore. While his executives argued about numbers and profits, Richard sat silently, staring out the windows, his thoughts far away. Every evening, Harris reported back with fragments of information. One blurry camera showed a figure bending over the crashed car. Another camera caught the same man walking away, carrying a heavy bag on his shoulder. The footage wasn't clear, but one thing was obvious, the man wasn't rich. His clothes were worn. His shoes looked broken. His bag seemed filled with scrap. "A recycler," Harris said one night. "Most likely someone who collects bottles, cans, or metal from the streets. That's all we know for now." Richard's chest tightened. A recycler. A man he would have once walked past without even seeing. A man he might have judged as worthless. And yet, this was the one who had saved his life. "We'll find him," Harris promised. Richard nodded but said nothing. Inside, he felt a strange mix of shame and determination. Shame because he had lived his whole life ignoring people like that. Determination because now, he would not stop until he met this one. Weeks later, Harris finally came with news. "We found him. His name is Daniel Gray. He lives in an old neighborhood on the edge of the city. He works every day collecting scrap and recyclables. No family. No steady job. Barely surviving." Richard leaned forward, his heart pounding. The name echoed in his mind, Daniel Gray. Not a man of wealth, not a man of power, but a man of courage. "Take me to him," Richard said firmly. That evening, Richard's car drove through narrow, broken streets he had never seen before. The houses were small and crumbling, the streetlights dim or missing. Children played barefoot near piles of trash. It was a world far from the shining towers where Richard lived. Finally, the car stopped in front of a tiny building with peeling paint. Harris pointed. "He lives there." Richard stepped out slowly, his cane supporting him. His injuries still hurt, but his determination pushed him forward. He walked toward the small house, his expensive shoes splashing in puddles. For the first time in years, he felt nervous. He knocked. The door opened, and there stood Daniel Gray, the recycler, the man who had dragged him from the wreck. His clothes were just as worn as before, his hands rough from work. His eyes widened in shock when he saw who stood at his door. "You," Richard said softly. His voice trembled, something rare for him. "It was you." Daniel stared at him, unsure. "You're the man from the accident." Richard nodded. "You saved my life." For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. The millionaire, dressed in fine clothes, and the recycler, standing in a doorway of a broken home. Two men from opposite worlds, bound by one night in the rain. Richard's heart pounded. He had found the man he had searched for. But now came the harder part. What would he say? How could he repay a debt as great as life itself? Daniel broke the silence first. His voice was calm, almost tired. "I didn't do it for thanks. I only did what anyone should do." Richard shook his head slowly. "No. You did what no one else did. And because of you, I am alive." Daniel looked away, as if uncomfortable. "I don't want money. I don't want reward. Please, just go." But Richard stepped closer, his eyes fierce with emotion. "I can't just walk away. You gave me back my life. And I won't rest until I give something back to you." Daniel hesitated. His world had taught him not to trust rich men. To him, they only cared about themselves. Yet as he looked into Richard's eyes, he saw something unusual, honesty, and perhaps even humility. The night air was thick with silence, both men standing in the doorway of a moment that would change them forever. And deep inside, Richard knew this was only the beginning. The night was still as Richard Collins stood outside Daniel Gray's small, crumbling house. The millionaire, who once ruled boardrooms and towered over city skylines, now looked humbled in front of a man society ignored. The rain from earlier had stopped, but the air was heavy, filled with words unsaid. "Please," Richard said again, his voice softer this time. "Let me do something for you." Daniel shook his head. "I told you already. I don't need money. I don't need reward. I only did what was right." Richard studied him carefully. The lines on Daniel's face showed years of struggle. His hands were rough, scarred from work. Behind him, the dim light revealed a room almost empty, just a chair, a small table, and a bed that looked older than Daniel himself. "Is this how you live?" Richard asked quietly. Daniel frowned. "It's enough. I survive." "Survive," Richard repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it. He thought of his mansion, his endless luxuries, his life of comfort. And then he thought of Daniel, who had nothing but still chose to risk his life for another man. It struck him like lightning. This was true strength. "Daniel," Richard said firmly, "you saved my life. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't go back to my world and forget you exist. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Daniel crossed his arms, his eyes guarded. "Owe me? No. You don't owe me anything. I didn't save you for debt. I saved you because I couldn't just leave a man to die." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had dealt with people who measured everything in numbers: profit, loss, gain, debt. Yet here was a man who measured life with nothing but humanity. "Then let me do this," Richard said, almost pleading now. "Let me give you a chance. Work with me. Not as charity, but as trust. I want you to come into my company. I will give you training, a stable job, a salary that can change your life. And your dignity will remain intact. You will earn it." Daniel blinked, stunned by the offer. He took a step back. "Why me? You have hundreds of people lined up for your jobs. Why someone like me?" Richard's voice grew steady, full of emotion. "Because you have something they don't. Heart. You didn't look at me as a millionaire. You looked at me as a man who needed help. That kind of honesty is rare, and I need people like you around me." Daniel stared at him, unsure whether to believe or not. His life had taught him that promises often broke, that rich men gave with one hand and took with the other. "And if I say no?" he asked. Richard smiled faintly. "Then I will still find another way to help you. Because I cannot live knowing I walked away from the man who gave me back my life." The silence stretched long. Daniel looked down at his rough hands, then back at Richard's steady gaze. For the first time, he saw something different in the millionaire's eyes, something real, something human. Finally, Daniel spoke in a low voice. "I don't want charity. If I take this chance, it will only be to earn an honest living." Richard nodded. "Then it's settled. You'll have your chance. Tomorrow, my car will come for you. We'll start fresh." Daniel hesitated, but something inside him whispered that this moment could change everything. Slowly, he gave a small nod. Relief washed over Richard. For the first time since the accident, he felt a weight lift from his chest. This was not about paying a debt anymore, it was about building something new. As Richard turned to leave, Daniel called out, "Why are you really doing this? You don't even know me." Richard paused at the doorway. His voice was quiet, but heavy with truth. "Because when I was lying there, dying, I realized something. All my money, all my power, it meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the hand that reached out for me. And that hand was yours." Daniel stood frozen as Richard walked away into the night. His heart was conflicted, torn between suspicion and hope. Could a man like Richard truly mean these words? Could his life, once filled with nothing but scraps, really change? The answer would come soon. Because the very next day, Daniel Gray would step into a world he had never known, a world of glass towers, polished floors, and endless wealth. And there, his story, and Richard's, would take a turn neither of them had expected. The next morning, a black car waited outside Daniel Gray's small, broken home. For a moment, he thought about refusing. Fear whispered inside him, fear of rich men's games, fear of being humiliated. But another voice spoke louder. "This could be the chance you've been waiting for." With steady steps, Daniel climbed inside. When he reached the company building, his breath caught. The glass tower rose high above the city, shining in the sunlight. People in fine suits walked quickly, holding files and tablets, their shoes polished, their voices sharp. Daniel felt out of place in his old shirt, but he held his head high. Inside, Richard Collins himself was waiting. The powerful millionaire greeted him not with arrogance, but with respect. "Daniel," he said warmly, "welcome." Employees nearby stared in shock. They had never seen their boss greet anyone this way, especially not a poor recycler. Whispers spread quickly, but Richard ignored them. He led Daniel through the shining halls and into his private office. "You don't need to understand everything today," Richard explained. "I'll give you training. You'll start small, but you'll grow. What matters is not your past, but what you're willing to do now. Daniel listened carefully. His heart was nervous, but determined. I'll do my best, he said. And he did. Day after day, Daniel arrived early. He learned from every task, sorting files, helping with deliveries, assisting managers. His clothes were still simple, but his work was honest. And slowly, people noticed. They saw his humility, his effort, his quiet strength. Some doubted him at first, but soon even the proud executives could not deny his dedication. Meanwhile, Richard watched closely. Every time he saw Daniel working, he felt something stir inside him, a reminder of the night he almost lost everything. And more importantly, a reminder of the man who had saved him not with wealth, but with courage. Weeks passed, and Daniel's life began to change. He was given his first real salary, money more than he had ever seen. He used it not for luxury, but for simple things, fixing his leaking roof, buying decent shoes, even helping a neighbor's child with school fees. To him, life was not about riches, but about dignity. One evening, Richard invited Daniel to his mansion. The grand halls, shining chandeliers, and endless rooms looked like another world. Daniel felt small in it, but Richard spoke to him like an equal. You've proven yourself, Richard said softly. Not just in work, but in heart. You showed me something no one else could. Daniel frowned. What's that? Richard looked out the window at the city below. That wealth means nothing if you lose your humanity. That night, I thought my life was over. And it would have been, if not for you. You gave me a second chance. And because of you, I don't want to live only for myself anymore. Daniel was silent. He had never imagined a man like Richard would speak such words. Then Richard turned, his eyes filled with emotion. Daniel, I don't just want you as an employee. I want you as my partner. I want you by my side, not because of business, but because I trust you. You saved me once. Maybe together, we can save others. Daniel's eyes widened. A partner. He had lived his whole life collecting scraps from trash, and now a millionaire was offering him a seat beside him. It was almost unbelievable. Slowly, Daniel nodded. If this is real, then yes. I'll stand with you. Richard smiled. For the first time in years, it was not the smile of a businessman, but of a man who had finally understood life. From that day forward, everything changed. Richard's company began new projects, not just for profit, but to help the poor, to build schools, to give jobs to those who had none. And always by his side was Daniel Gray, the man the world once ignored. People whispered about it. Newspapers wrote stories. Some called it strange, others called it foolish. But those who looked closely saw the truth. Two men from different worlds, bound by one night of fate, had found purpose together. Richard had his wealth. Daniel had his dignity. And both had something greater than either had known before, friendship, respect, and a shared heart. The story spread far and wide. But for Richard and Daniel, it was not about fame. It was about remembering a single truth: no life is too small, no man is too poor to make a difference. And so, the millionaire who once lay dying on a rainy road found new life not in riches, but in the unlikely hero who saved him. The end was not the end at all. It was a beginning.